Here. Good evening, everybody. Let's call this meeting to order. Let's see. I'm in the panoramic view where I can see everybody. And so I see, is your name pronounced Zaira or Zyra?
Zyra.
Zyra, okay, Zyra, Katie is here, Karen is here,
If
Ned is here.
I can do the roll call.
Okay, good, all right.
So,
I'm sorry, I looked through Robert's Rules of Parliamentary Procedure, but
and I understand
I've never-
tomorrow's your the training, so it's okay.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. So let me start the roll call. So Brenda,
Here,
Melanie,
Here.
Jennifer,
Here.
Ned,
Here.
Wesley,
Here.
Sean. Just join. Sean. Okay, I see him. Ron.
Here.
Alexander.
Here.
Okay. Everyone's here except for Mayor Rogers.
do we wait for him to come or do we just proceed?
He won't be attending today.
Okay. All right, so has everybody had the opportunity to review the meeting minutes? I just doubted myself, so. Okay,
Can I make a motion to approve the minutes? I think that's what comes with that, right?
right. So is there a second?
I second.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to mention one thing. I requested some information.
Wait, we need
Go
a
ahead.
vote, all hands to vote if they approve the minutes being approved.
Okay, let's do that then. All in favor? Okay. All
Ron,
opposed?
are you voting?
Okay, all opposed? Okay, well, the ayes have it then. Okay, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I had asked for some information a while back, and I believe I sent the request to everybody. I'm not very up on parliamentary procedure. It's the first time I've ever been a member of one of these things, and certainly the first time I've ever run one. So my question is, are we going to reasonably be able to get any information? Any of the requested information?
I think we were holding off to give you anything because a lot of those questions are going to be answered in the presentations that you'll see probably a lot tonight and then throughout the committee meetings.
Okay,
So it's just kind of with due time that you're going to see that information.
okay. All right,
And Brenda, if there's something that we haven't answered, feel free to ask again and we'll get you the information that we have. So,
okay, sounds good. All right, so do we have a presentation then for tonight?
Yeah, we do. That's the next agenda item on there.
Okay.
We have two separate presentations. One will be by Karin and then the other will be by Deb.
Okay. Does anybody have anything before we begin the presentations? Okay, if not, why don't we just begin them then?
Zyra's going to run the presentation for me. again, for those of you who don't know, I'm Karen Hoffman. I'm the city engineer. And I'm going to be presenting all of the wastewater projects that are in the 5-year CIP plan, which directly feeds into what Deb will talk about after I'm done. Obviously, the CIP is one of the big components, along with materials and services, of what goes into the rates. So next slide, please. So here is a really high-level overview of the wastewater system itself. You'll see the green lines are gravity lines. The red lines are force mains with pump stations in really light green, so you really can't see them. And then at the bottom of the slide, you see the wastewater treatment plant. So all of the wastewater goes down into the treatment plant, is treated before it is then discharged into the Willamette River for the liquids, and then the solids are turned into compost. That's how our system works. Next slide, please. So here's a list of the projects that the committee saw last time around, 2 years ago. And so these were the projects that were in that list, in that model. And so I'll give you a quick update, and then we'll talk about the projects that are coming up. So Influent infiltration is actually a project that continues on. It will continue to do it for the next several years. So we just pick a section every year to do. Structural improvements to the existing oxidation ditch, that is actually just completed. The infiltration report hasn't occurred yet. That's still a couple years out. The PLC replacement, which is the programmable logic control, which runs the treatment plant, we're in the process of working on that project right now. The maintenance yard is another one that's an ongoing project. We do pieces of it as we move through the years. The dehydration unit rebuild was actually scheduled to go a couple years ago. And then when we inspected it before to get started, it didn't need it yet. So we've pushed it out another year or so. So that's still in plan, but it has not happened yet. The Hess Creek lining project, we have been working on getting a bunch of background information about how do we bypass the system, where the easements currently are, those types of things. So the project is ongoing and taking several years to do that. The Northeast Chehalem Extension project is actually under construction. That started construction this past summer. The wastewater treatment plant hydraulic improvements that will start this year. Roofing replacements have been ongoing. I think we have one more roof to do, and you'll see that in the next 5-year plan also. Short-term lift station improvements haven't started yet. Pinehurst Court improvements haven't started yet. Hess Creek Phase 2 hasn't started yet. North Springbrook Road trunk line hasn't started yet. Solar farm. Actually, I'm not sure if this committee saw the solar farm. We ended up with a grant to help build that solar farm, and it is almost complete. It should be complete by the end of November. The East Crestview Drive extension that comes along with, we did water, non-potable water in the street, along with the wastewater. And that project is wrapping up, should be done by the end of November also. And the clarifier study is complete. Next slide, please. So here's a list of the 5-year, the proposed 5-year plan wastewater projects. And I'll have a slide for each one as we move forward. So next slide, please. So Influent infiltration projects. So these projects are where actually groundwater or stormwater is entering into the wastewater pipes and then is getting taken to the treatment plant. And there's no need for them to go to the treatment plant and be treated in this way. So the more what we call I&I you have in your pipes, the larger your pipes have to be and the larger your treatment train needs to be. So if we can reduce the amount of water that goes into these pipes that doesn't have to be treated, then we can delay capacity-related pipeline impacts and costs. So we don't have to make the pipes bigger and those types of things.
Karen, I got a question on this.
Uh-huh.
So, when it rains, when we get a major storm, there's a lot of stormwater.
Correct.
So you're wanting to reduce the volume going to the treatment plant?
Right. The stormwater doesn't have to go to the wastewater treatment plant. It
Okay,
doesn't
so
treat
in
it.
other words, it would go directly to the Willamette River. Is that what the plan is?
For the stormwater,
Yeah.
actually, a lot of it goes directly to the river through the streams. But lately, we also have a bunch of wastewater or stormwater quality facilities that help clean the water before it goes into the river. So
Okay.
stormwater and wastewater, have a different treatment train, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And we
Karen, does that mean that you've, excuse me, but does that mean that you've you removed all large pieces from the stormwater before it goes into the river? Like branches and the lake, stuff that could potentially clog the river if it goes into it?
yeah, they don't end up in the river.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay. Did I get
Yeah, that's
there's-
fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. We have, based on the projects we've done in the last several years, we've had a 37% reduction of stormwater and groundwater flow to the wastewater treatment plant, which is pretty awesome. So there's a list of projects that we've done. And in this year, we're going to be working in the South Charles Street area, again, in the downtown to get projects or reduce, again, more stormwater and groundwater infiltrating those pipes. We'll be spending $450,000 to $550,000 over the next 5 years to complete the needed repairs, and there's about 50% of it is SDC eligible. Next slide, please. So inflow and infiltration report. So we did a report back in 2015 for a couple of the basins within the city, and which directed us in the priorities on which projects were the most important and we're seeing the most impact. And so we've been working through those projects. So we'll do another report and we'll focus on the other basins and also relook at the Dayton and Winooski Basin to see, to be able to quantify, how well we've been doing with reducing the infiltration. And again, it's 50% SDC eligible. Next slide, please. This is the project I spoke about earlier, the dehydration unit rebuild. So the picture on the top is what it looks like before it gets rebuilt. And then the picture on the bottom is what it looks like after we're done. And this is kind of an ongoing maintenance. We have to do it every 7 to 10 years. Again, we looked at it a couple of years ago. It was not yet ready. And so we'll continue to look at it every year and start that project when it is ready to be completed. Next slide, please. This is the project I was speaking about that we've been doing a lot of background information, doing a lot of flow monitoring to determine how much flow is actually in this pipe and where we have access to get to the pipe. So the project itself is intended to line the upper portion of the trunk line to reduce the INI and extend the life of the pipe. We'll also be looking at whether or not we should or can move it out of the creek. Right now, it's mostly in Hess Creek. And you'll see in a minute, the project to the south actually pulls the pipe out of the creek bed. In this section of pipe, it is more challenging to pull it out because Hess Creek runs through everybody's backyards in this location. So to pull that pipe out is going to be challenging if we can even do it. So next slide, please. The Northeast Chehalem Extension Project, as I noted, is under construction now. And this is bringing there's a current pump station there on Highway 240, just just west of Illinois Avenue. And so we're extending the pipe, the wastewater line from there across the creek, Chehalem Creek, and then up Chehalem Drive. And this is going to allow a lot of those properties that are on the west end to develop. We've had quite a few conversations with people who wanted to, but they need both water and sewer. So when we talk about water, you'll see that the water extension is also under construction as the same project. One thing I'll note is that we try, when we're building the 5-year plan, if we're doing, say, this wastewater extension, we try to look to see if there are other utilities that need to happen at the same time, to try and get more bang for our buck and build more projects together rather than piecemeal if we can at all. So that's always the goal. Next slide, please. So the hydraulic improvements. This is a group of projects to improve the hydraulic flow at the treatment plant. It was identified in the wastewater master plan. So again, there's a list of projects that will happen with that, and we'll start that project later on this year. Next slide, please. Again, roofing replacements. We've been working through these 1 or so a year. And so we're down to the last 2. And these will be completed over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. Short-term lift station improvements. So this project includes minor improvements to almost all of the lift stations. And there are things like adding bollards for traffic safety, adding additional fences. What you'll see in this picture is we actually have a wastewater facility right here, a pump station or a lift station. And you know, it really shouldn't be quite this open and available to the public. So we'll be doing, there's a list of short-term improvements that we need to do, and we'll take those on and get those done in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. Pinehurst Court improvements. This location was identified as a possible overflow site. It has not overflowed, but this project would fix this problem that the model shows, and there's no SDC eligibility for that. Next slide, please. And obviously I've still got the phase 1 picture on here. I apologize for that. So the phase 2 project would actually be further south from here. And that would pull that existing line out of Hess Creek and put it up on the hill. But it would require a new pump station be installed. And there's $4.7 million in the 5-year plan. And it's about 2% SDC eligible. Next slide, please. Riverfront lift station. For those of you who don't know, we just completed the Riverfront master plan. And we're working on the urban renewal plan, and that's a lot of it is happening in this Riverfront area. So this project would install a new lift station to serve this area. And then what it will also do is allow us to take the Charles lift station and the Andrew lift station offline. So reducing our operations and maintenance costs by one lift station, which is always a good thing. And again, it's about $5 million with 100% SDC eligibility. Next slide, please. And the compost sale pile cover. So again, as I noted, that we create compost out of the solids, and over the winter, most people don't come and buy compost, so we collect these large piles. And so we've been talking about covering it, and there's a list of benefits to that. It prevents the rain from separating those pieces out. It will provide a higher quality product in the spring. And then we could use dry compost for dry recycling in the wet months. So allowing us to get more efficiency out of that. So we'll be looking at constructing this cover in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. The North Springbrook trunk line. So this project will increase the capacity of the Springbrook Road line. It includes a parallel line. And as we've been doing some other projects north of here, it may not need to happen. Although it's still showing in the model, it needs to happen. Anytime something is in the master plan or in the model, before we actually start work on the project, we go back and evaluate whether or not the assumptions that were in place when the master plan was put in place, or the model, are still accurate. You know, what we make estimations, you know, 10 years in advance of where we think growth will be, or those types of things. So we always have to go back and recheck to make sure that we really need to do this project when we're showing we need to do it. So that will happen. And again, we're doing some other projects further north that are moving some of the wastewater to other basins. So this project may not need to happen. Next slide, please. And here's a couple of multi-funded projects. Again, you'll see this in every single rate utility that you'll see. The maintenance facility, because it serves wastewater, water, stormwater, and transportation. You'll see it show up in all of the rates. So we're doing projects, adding the fuel station. We're doing some more paving. We're doing some cleanup work. Eventually, we want to install a new fleet building. Right now, we have basically a big covered tent that we do a lot of the fleet work for the larger trucks in, which becomes a challenge in the wintertime. So, so those are all projects within this maintenance facility. Next slide, please. And then here's some projects that are out further than the 5-year plan, but they're just something to keep in mind, and you'll know why when Deb starts to talk about reserves and building some cash up. So we have some other longer term projects, larger projects, another master plan update. We have to do those every 10 years. We have additional lift station improvements. We have a new oxidation ditch that we're expected to need to construct. We've got the Hess Creek lift station, a lift station upsize at Highway 240, and then the Charles and Andrew lift station removal that we spoke about as part of the Riverfront lift station. Next slide. And that's it on projects. Any questions about any of those?
Yes. If I can get my video going here in just a minute. Start video. Okay. Is this a good time to cross-reference what you've shown to the table of all the projects and numbers and estimates of costs going out 8-9 years? Because that was also sent to us.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, for example, I was just cross-referencing ones that you talked about with the table. And there are a couple of large ones in the very first column of that table, fiscal year 2022, that you didn't mention. And I was just wondering, like, for example, the second row, 108,000 for sawdust bays. Is that for the compost making?
Yeah, so we have sawdust bays. We use sawdust in the making of compost.
Right.
And so, yes, that is. And what you'll see is I did not put projects in that were going to be completed this year because already in the rates. That's why some of them aren't there if they're just in this fiscal year in that first column. So
right. And one other large one that kind of stood out, Elliott Road wastewater. Is that part of the street improvements going on to or about to start? What's the status of that one? Because $600,000 in this first fiscal year, that's a pretty big chunk of change.
Right. So we're looking at lining the entire length of the wastewater line in Elliott Road. Mm-hmm. And we'll be out to bid in the next month or so. on Elliott
Okay.
Road.
Okay.
Again, as I spoke about, we try to, if we're doing a street project, we try to get all of the underground utilities done before we pave, just so we don't
Sure.
tear it back up later. So,
Right. Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
so it is part of that project. It'll all be
Okay.
constructed at the same time.
Right. Last question, a more general one. When a project is estimated to be paid out over a number of years, are you figuring into those estimates out, one to several years that costs are going up? So as far as, it's going to be more expensive as something's not done till 5 years or so.
Yes, yeah, they are inflated.
Okay.
Deb does that in her little magic model numbers thing.
Right. Because we don't want to have a surprise where you've got 3.5 million and we get to that point and it's 5 million and then we have to increase rates further to cover it.
Agreed. Agreed.
Okay.
And the thing to keep in mind is we update the 5-year plan every year.
Mhm.
So every year before we go to budget, we update the 5-year plan. And then in the years that we do this rate review, we actually update the 5-year plan twice, because we update it in March
Mhm.
and then we'll update it again now,
Okay.
before we hit each one. So,
Right.
so the 5-year plan continues to roll.
Mhm.
And sometimes projects will drop off or get
Yeah.
pushed out because we decide, it's not the right time.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're always looking at that bottom line number. And again, when Deb starts to talk about what she looks at, every year when we plug those in, we try to make sure although the projects may change a little bit, the numbers stay the same. Or if I have to bump it in one year because of whatever reason, I make sure I lower it in the next year.
Okay.
So
Okay. Thanks.
kind of a moving target. It's not a
Right.
like, it gets set and it's that way for the next 5 years.
Sure.
It would make my life way easier, but it doesn't work
Yeah.
that way.
Right. Understood. Okay.
All
Thanks.
right. Anything else from anybody?
Just one question. Are any of these projects fully funded? I mean, I might be missing something, but I can't really tell. I mean, are
Yes.
these projects fully funded now?
Well, yes and no. I mean, they're not, we only budget one on a fiscal year basis. So they're technically not funded until the budget is adopted.
Right.
But whatever's plugged into the 5-year plan is assumed that it will be fully funded.
Okay, so if you've got a 5-year plan, you've considered that, you've already put that into your rate base calculation, right?
Mhm.
That's what Deb will talk about next. Yep.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Mhm. Anything else? All right.
Okay. I guess that turns it over to me to talk about the financial aspects. Do you want me to run the presentation from my screen?
Yeah, if that works
that-
for you, you can. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Give me a minute here to share screen and go to the PowerPoint for tonight. Share. Okay, let's get into presentation mode. And what are you seeing? Just the cover page or notes too?
Nope, I see the notes also.
Okay.
And
let
I
me
see the
s-
next slide in a small
Yeah,
one in the
great.
upper right.
Okay. Let me change my display to swap. How's that?
Good.
Better.
Better?
Nice.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is the first of what we anticipate to be 2 wastewater meetings. Again, wastewater, sewer, we use interchangeably. So whenever we present the initial numbers, there may be changes before we get to the end. So we are still refining our work. This is the first system that we're working on, and there was, this is one of the more complex in terms of the funding and the capital. So just know that we're still refining numbers, and you may have some questions and So this is, consider this all draft. Tonight, we're going to focus on the overall revenue needs. I'll give you a little bit of information about revenue that comes from customer classes and rate components, but we're really not going to be focused on the rate schedule and customer bills until the next meeting. So just know that this is part of the information. What we will focus on tonight is these two blocks here, the blue and the one shade of green, the revenue sources, revenue from rates, talk about other fees and charges, and reserves, and then walk through the different, what we call revenue requirement components. These are what I think, Brenda, you sometimes refer to as rate base. The basis for setting the rates is the revenue requirements. And so we'll talk about those different components. I will show you what's the projected overall revenue needs are, which are consistent with the prior plan. And as I said, just some introductory information about the rate components and customer classes and revenue from classes. We always start this process looking at how the money comes in and projecting under the current rates what things are looking like, and from each of the various sources. This pie chart shows you for sewer utility enterprise the sources of revenue by main type. The largest one, over 80%, is revenue that comes in each year from wastewater rates. These are the user charges. That totals about $9 million from wastewater rates currently. There's about half a million or so that comes then from other fees and charges, including compost sales and other miscellaneous type charges, interest income. And then in this particular year, this is the current budget year, systems development charges were pretty robust. They were about estimated to be about 1.5 million. These revenues are highly variable based on development activity. So while this year was 1.5 million, I think last year was 3 million, we're projecting forward based on what developments are in the pipeline. It's averages about 500,000 per year. So just know that this slice of pie here that's currently 14%, it's going to shrink on average and be a smaller portion of the total. Just to give you a little bit of history looking at the last 10 years, you can see that in January 2013, the only year in this 10-year period where there wasn't a rate increase, and that was because there had been some very significant rate increases previously. The city secured a clean water loan from a state agency that had very favorable lending terms. And so we're able to basically forego a rate increase that year, and the subsequent rate increases then range from 3% to 5.75%. As in 2015-16, there was the major wastewater treatment plant expansion occurred. And so there were some higher rate increases as those costs got finalized and the work begun, and just to make sure that there was money there to repay that loan and meet all of the loan obligations as well as the rest of the system. And then council, then it was pretty much a 3.5% rate plan. However, council in 17 and 18 directed additional funding for those infiltration and inflow projects that Karin talked about because of the benefits to reducing infiltration and inflow in the system. And so there was a little bit of a bump up those 2 years to get the capital spending at a level that it could sustain more funding towards infiltration and inflow projects. The last 4 years have been that 3.5%. And as part of the prior process, the annual projected increases for the next 2 years that this committee is going to be making recommendations on. That plan had assumed 3.5% continued rate increases for fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24. While the fiscal year begins in July, the rate increases since 2013 have been on a January 1 basis. So the rate increases go in after the beginning of the fiscal year. So not all of the revenue, increased revenue is realized that first year. This chart just gives you a little bit of context with and comparison of national averages in terms of wastewater bills compared to the consumer price index. And you can see the light yellow bars. That's the average change in the wastewater bill of the utilities that participated in this survey. It was a nationwide survey that was conducted by the Clean Water Agency, National Association of Clean Water Agencies. And you can see that the range here, that kind of a similar range as what was shown for Newberg, and in the 3 to 6% per year increases each year. The comparatively, the CPI, that was about double the rate of inflation in most of these years. You can see the brown bar was in most cases half as much or even less than half as much as the wastewater rate increases. And that's because I think somebody asked about, are these projects funded? We as an industry, and this is true for all of the systems that we'll be talking about, have not done a good job in terms of charging rates that really reflect the true cost of the service when you consider the need to repair and replace the system. These are systems that are largely unseen by the public, except for streets. Streets are always one that everybody notices. But when you flush your toilet, you don't see, most people don't see where all that goes. And so it's often hard to get the political will to have these increases to support a consistent level of repair replacement in the system. I think the city's done a great job of getting the rates to a level and supported by the Citizen Rate Review Committee over the many years, and to get the system's funding a level of capital that addresses not only regulatory requirements, but also begins to do that needed repair and replacement. Most utilities have a significant backlog, and that's why the rate increases have to outpace inflation, because we're doing catch up. So that just gives you a little context for where things are in the industry with respect to rate increases. This shows from that same survey what other utilities are projecting for average bill increases through 2025 compared to the 3.5% that was in the prior plan and is in the current plan as it stands right now. You'll notice, not surprisingly, that 2021 was significantly lower, and that was because many utilities did not deferred rate increases because of COVID. and the economic concerns. And the city really weighed that decision heavily, I remember, but eventually did continue to support and implement those needed rate increases because they didn't want, in part, to see what you see here, which is kind of, you've got a flat annual increases, and in the case of the other utilities, foregoing or deferring rate increases means higher rate increases later. And the city has experienced this over in the longer than 10-year history, looking back, some pretty staggering increases when the can was kicked down the road and rate increases were not implemented. One of the primary drivers of annual rate revenue is the water use that is billed in the winter months, or that the customers use water during the winter that returns, most of which returns to the sewer system. When you're using water in the summer, oftentimes it's for outdoor irrigation and other purposes that do not return to the sewer system. So the industry standard for residential customers is to charge the volumetric portion of the rates based on the winter water use. So we're not penalizing customers who use more water during the summer for irrigation. So this shows you the projected versus the actual billed volumes. Because the water use that is billed for wastewater rates is winter use, there doesn't tend to be the same level of sensitivity and fluctuation in wastewater volumes as there are with water volumes, because of the seasonal usage and the fact that weather is a major factor in how much water you use during the summer. But you will see here that there was a bit of a dip, and in 2020, and part of that was COVID coming on, and so this is total water use. So this would include your non-residential customers, industry and institutional and commercial customers. And so, but that usage has come back up and stabilized. It has not come back up to the level that was projected in the prior plan. And so all things being equal, wastewater rate revenue would be lower than the prior plan because of that dip and where the red bar is. However, offsetting that is the fact that the number of customers increased at a faster rate than was projected previously. So the
Deb,
portion of,
on the y-axis of this graph, is that really hundreds of cubic feet?
Oh, good catch, Ned. No, that should be number of accounts. Sorry,
Okay.
I was copying my graph and didn't update that. So yeah, these are number of counts. And you can see that in this case, the red is higher, which are the actuals, or the estimated for the current year is higher than the blue, which was the prior plan projections. So that means that there is more revenue coming in the terms of the fixed charge. So this, just to give you a sense again as to what the rate structure looks like. And when I talk about the fixed charge versus the volume charge, your bill that you pay is has these two components. The service, or the fixed charge, is the same every month, no matter what your usage is, whether and water. This is the same between water and sewer. And for multifamily, there's an additional charge per unit that's slightly lower than the the full service charge that's paid at the account level. The volume charge is that portion of the rate that is dependent on your particular use. And so therefore, if you're a large family that on average uses more, you could use the same amount per person as a small family, but the fact that you use more and you're discharging more volume in the system, and that volume also has pollutants in it, you're going to pay more by the virtue of the fact that you're using more and discharging more water. So there's the volume portion that varies based on the type of class. The service charge is the same no matter what class you are, with the exception, as I said, that there's this additional multifamily unit charge that recovers a portion of the fixed costs. That includes some of that infiltration and inflow related cost, and because that's a community-wide issue that is not related to the amount of flow that you are discharging. It's as Karen showed in her picture of it's got a lot of different factors that contribute to I&I, and so everybody has to contribute to paying for those costs. So the differential by class is reflective of the estimated pollutant concentration of the wastewater discharged. So there is no difference in the concentration generally between a multifamily and a single family. It's all domestic wastewater. So everybody pays the same unit cost. That's the case also for many commercial customers that are just, discharging waste related to restrooms and other things. Where we get into higher strength wastewater is when we're talking about, you can see the type of customers that are in commercial 2 and commercial 3, restaurants, some industrial customers, car washes, markets, especially markets that have grinders and things like that are putting food, grease, other things into the discharging into the system. It costs more to handle. We have to build facilities to handle that to remove those pollutants, and there are chemical and other costs that the city incurs to treat that wastewater. So under cost of service principles and equity, fairness, if you have higher concentrated waste, you pay more per unit than domestic customers. And we'll talk a lot more about this aspect of the rates at the next meeting, but that just to give you a sense as to why the rates are different. One of the key things that the Citizen Rate Review Committee has made recommendations on over the past 5 to 10 years has been what's of an appropriate balance in terms of revenue recovered from the fixed portion of the bill, that service charge, versus the volume portion. And part of it's reflective of the type of costs that are recovered through each component, that you wouldn't recover customer service costs through the volume charge, because the fact that I'm using more water, the city doesn't incur any more costs in sending me a bill just because my usage is higher. So some of it's just based on equity. And then that infiltration and inflow piece of that, certain costs are fixed regardless of my use and my pollutant load. And so those costs, and the fact that the industry standard is that even though from an accounting standpoint, 85, 90% of the cost in any given year are fixed for the utility. And if people use less water, the costs still are there. They don't go away. So the standard is more closer to 40% of costs recovered on a fixed basis. So you can see here that very deliberately and thoughtfully, the fixed charges have been increased relative to the volume charges since 2016 to continue to ramp up to achieve closer to the industry standard of 40%. And that's something that the committee can consider and discuss at the next meeting as well. So starting to look at some numbers here, I always like to look back at what we projected in the prior update and compare that to the way things are looking now. It helps us understand, do the trending, what are the trends? Were our assumptions, valid, and do we need to modify those at all going forward? And it also helps us to understand, do we need to modify the rate increase that was in the plan for the current 2 years as part of the new process? For the rates, things were remarkably consistent. Within 1% is pretty good in this business, especially when you have a pandemic and things that were not anticipated at the time that the process got going last time. We were all meeting at the wastewater treatment plant in person. But you can see here that, this is the rate revenue. The actual is in the blue. Those are in the books. It's happened already. Those are the numbers. You can see that compared to what was estimated. And then the going forward is projected based on the number of accounts and the growth that we're projecting. And both sets of numbers use 3.5% continued annual revenue increases. I think Brenda had asked where, for a breakdown of how the revenue is recovered by customer class. So this gives you, this is one of the information pieces that was requested. So I created this table to show you for the 9.1 million that's estimated in the current budget year, how that is distributed by customer class. So you can see that most of your customers and most of your revenue comes from residential customers, whether that be single home customers or customers living in apartments or townhomes, which we refer to as multifamily. Commercial customers are the commercial 2 class is the highest of the non-residential, about 8% of total. Commercial 3, which is the restaurants primarily, represents about 2%. And commercial 1, which is retail and office, 5.7%. Very, very small portion of outside city. It's teeny tiny. And industrial is a fairly small portion of the total as well. So that's the revenue side of things. Again, about 9.1 million is what your rates are generating currently. When we talk about and evaluate the adequacy of that revenue to meet the system needs, we have to consider what are the current and the projected future requirements. So there are 2 types of revenue requirement structures that are used in the utility rate setting industry. The first is the cash basis, and that is what is used primarily by municipal utilities, because it looks at just what are the cash needs in any given year. I've got to pay staff, materials, and I have to repay my debt on my existing and any planned additional debt service. And then I've got capital projects that Karin talked about that are going to be funded either by systems development charges if they're related to growth, or my rates, or my cash reserves. So it's just a, it aligns with the budget. The budget outlines what are the needs, what are the revenue sources. That is the cash basis way of determining the revenue requirements. The other type of revenue requirement structure is used in regulated utilities, investor-owned, and in some cases, other public utilities that in states where they're regulated by a utility commission. And in that case, you still have operation and maintenance costs as one of your items, but your capital costs, instead of being debt service and cash funding of capital, it's the depreciation on the assets and a return on the rate base. And the rate base is basically the value of the system today. So we're not doing that. That's not the way the structure is for determining what evaluating the revenue needs for the any of the systems. We're just looking at what are the cash needs in any given year. So now it's not to say that depreciation is not something that we consider, but we don't consider it as a cash need that needs to be funded each year. The depreciation does give us some sense of how much we should be setting aside, perhaps, or keeping in reserves for emergency. And so it is used in kind of when we're giving a range of what minimum reserve levels should be, it does factor into the equation, but it is not something that the utility, doesn't represent a cash need in any given year. This pie chart shows you, breaks down the O&M costs, operation and maintenance costs, by the type of costs that are included. So you can see personnel is almost 40% of the total, materials and services, 35%. Internal services, that includes support functions, legal, accounting, things like that, that are distributed across all of the funds. So sewer has to pay its share. And then the franchise fees, which are charged on all the utilities, both private and the public utilities, that go back to the general fund. The franchise fees are 10% of the O&M costs. They're not 10, they're calculated based on the revenue. So they are 7% of the rate revenue. For forecasting purposes, we look at the actuals over, the last 5 years. We look at the budget. I talked to Karin and other staff who are responsible for the budgets. We talk about, are there new staff that are needed in this planning period? Are there any one-time expenses that are included in the budget year that we can reduce the next year? Then we consider the economic conditions, what's happening, with insurance rates and PERS, which is the retirement costs. And then, so we generally take the budget and then we apply these escalation factors to forecast forward with adjustments for what we call known and measurable changes. Capital costs, as you might heard, and you might have been experiencing yourself if you're doing any home improvements or there's been some supply chain issues, and it's driving up all sorts of costs. And so some of these escalation factors have been increased compared to the last update. And interest earnings are one of those, things that can be difficult to predict as well. But the franchise fee, as I said, is based on the sales revenue. So once we forecast the sales revenue, then we apply that factor. And contingency is, the base contingency is based on 60 days of operation and maintenance costs. And that is kind of the, I would say the minimum that we would want to assume. It's consistent with other utilities of similar size as Newberg. But you'll see that when we look at the reserves, we're not saying, yeah, draw down all the cash down to this contingency. This is just this is the operating portion of the contingency. So $9 million or so of revenue. This shows you one of the requirements of that revenue is operation and maintenance costs, which in the current budget year total about 6.5, close to 6.5 million. And you can see in this case, it's broken down by the major department or function of the utility. So you've got engineering costs, operations costs, which is primarily, I believe, and Karin can correct me if I'm wrong, but the plant, the wastewater treatment plant, whereas the collection maintenance division does the sewer lines primarily. So within these divisions, there are personnel costs, materials and services costs, and I believe in the engineering is some of those shared city costs as well. The one thing you'll notice here is a very favorable difference between what we projected in the previous plan. Again, remember that was, we had already made the projections and finished the process when the pandemic hit. And so while the rates had not yet been adopted by the council, the work had already been done. So as has occurred in other places as well, some of the spending on some of the routine repair and maintenance and things that are budgeted within the operating budget didn't happen. And so, and the additional staff that had been in the prior plan didn't happen. So you see that there was quite a bit of savings that occurred relative to what had been projected. And so that favorable difference results in we start this process with more cash in the bank, which is a nice thing to have. Obviously, you don't want to continue that out if you're not, doing the needed maintenance and whatnot for a long period of time. But you can see that now that the city is estimating that things are much more in alignment with what had been projected before, but still somewhat lower. So, so that's a good thing. So that is takes some pressure off of the rates. It's money that can be used to fund needed capital. This chart gives you a summary of the entire plan period, shows you where the capital improvement funding is going to come from. And as I believe Ned said, you got all the detail that was sent to you. It would not fit very well on a PowerPoint slide. So we sent that table to you that has each individual project and the year that those projects are programmed into the budget. These numbers do include inflation, and the systems development charge portion, the SDC portion, is based on what the SDC eligibility is. And Karin walked through that, and the table shows that for each project. That eligibility is determined based on the master planning process and the systems development charge methodology. By state law, SDCs, or at least the improvement SDC portion of the SDC, can only be used to fund those projects that expand capacity in the system for future growth. Karin mentioned there's a lot of kind of repair, replacement kind of projects that aren't related to growth. And so those need to be paid for through the rates. So you can see that in the capital fund, so that the city has multiple funds, even within the wastewater utility, there's a separate beginning fund balance and sources and uses of funds for what I refer to as the operating fund or the wastewater fund. And then there's a capital fund, and that the reserves or the beginning fund balance in that fund right now, about 6.5 million, close to that. And then you can see transfers or support of capital from the rates is almost 16 million. And the SDCs have a sizable share because there are some expensive growth related projects. But that ending balance is pretty low. So with the 3.5% rate increase and this level of funding for rates and SDCs, you would also still have to utilize the majority of your reserves that are shown in the capital fund. This is not all the reserves, and I'll show you that in a minute. But we're looking at about $31.5 million over this period. And those are the revenue sources. No additional debt is planned at this point in time because there was that major debt within the last 5 years for the plant expansion. This shows you just graphically, and again, you've got the detail of how that spending occurs. As Karin said, try to keep it kind of levelized and consistent, but there's just sometimes you just got to build a really big project and or big in terms of cost, and other years not so much. So there's always some, seldom is it just completely flat. This is a pretty typical kind of pattern.
Deb, I got a quick question on
Sure.
that graph. If you
Go ahead.
back.
Yeah.
I know it's so hard to predict out so many years, but the last two bars, hardly any SDCs. Is that reflecting like really slowing down growth of the size of town, or reaching the urban growth boundary and no more expansion?
No, I think it's, and I don't remember, Karin might be able to speak to that. I don't remember which projects are out here, but it's just the nature of the project, not necessarily what's going to happen, projection of what's going to happen with growth. It's just, you need to build capacity to enable growth. So, you do need to front load, if you're expecting growth, you need to front load that. So make sure that there is that, but it's just, there are, actually there are some significant SDC fund balances remaining after this period of time, which is for additional growth improvements that occur beyond this plan.
Okay.
Deb, can you talk to the trend as far as 2022 rates and reserves are high, they dip down, and then they go back up to a steady state 2025. Can you explain that transition? I think, missed it.
Well, so this just shows you the sort of the beginning of the planning period and the very end. It doesn't really show you what's happening in between. I will say that, so the city, and one of the refinements that we'll be making to this plan is the city made some changes the way it shows funds for like things like equipment replacement, kind of moved some money over to the utility funds instead of it being in a separate fund. And so, and one of the other things it did was to move some of what had been in the wastewater fund over to the wastewater capital fund beyond what it needs to build projects in the current year. So this 6.5 million, in some cases, prior rate review processes, the capital fund was kind of used just as money in, money out. It never really accumulated balance. It was all shown in the wastewater fund. Now we've got some that's over in the capital fund and some that's in the wastewater fund. So I think I can better address your question when we get further in the presentation, a few slides, because there I show what the actual annual modification is. So let's hold that question if we can, and then Ron, if I haven't answered it in a few slides, we can I can take another shot at it. So yeah, that's the capital spending. This does show you the projected reserves now, looking at all the different funds and the different components. Again, it's just 2021, 22, beginning of plan and end of plan. But I have a chart that shows what happens in the wastewater fund in each year coming up. So let me just explain here, though, what these different lines are. You've got the operating contingency, which, as I said previously, is 60 days basically of operation and maintenance requirements. You need, for cash flow reasons, you need to keep some money in reserves, because the way you spend money isn't the same every month. And so that's one reason to have contingencies. Things break, unexpectedly, costs don't, or revenue doesn't come in the same every month. So there's lots of reasons to plan for a contingency. And debt service is another one that just standard industry practice is you reserve, your debt payment may be at the beginning of the year, the fiscal year. So you've got to have money from last year to make that payment while you're collecting additional revenue from customers throughout the year. So, and then there's, so the capital is related to just, this is the end of year capital balance after what I showed you before was the beginning of the year in the capital fund. And after the, in 2022, after the capital improvements that are scheduled for 2022 are constructed, that's what is projected to remain, about 4.7 million. Other are things like equipment replacement reserves and just undesignated ending fund balance. So the combined of all of that is close to 10 million, is estimated to be about 10 million at the end of this current year. And on top of that, there's 9 million approximately in SDCs. As I said, you will be drawing down SDCs to pay for these projects in yellow in the mostly in the first half of the plan. And you'll still have significant SDC reserves towards the end of the plan if all goes according to plan. But as I mentioned, there are additional growth related projects that are beyond this planning window. Overall, there is a reduction in the combined reserves compared to the end of this current fiscal year and the end of the plan. And it's important to consider, you know, is that still within the guidelines that we think are reasonable? So there are policy guidelines that are established by the utility industry. This just shows you one of the manuals. The American Water Works Association has some guidelines on cash reserves, and basically they say, like what we have done here, is you need to have an operating contingency, you need to have a debt reserve, you need to keep some money if you want to be able to, when you look at the lumpy investments, you want to be able to smooth that, you need to have cash on hand. So in years where expenses are high, you can use reserves and you don't have to raise rates just to fund the expenses in that year. And the flip side is, on years when the cash needs are less, then you can add back to your reserves. And then it helps to smooth out the rate increases. And so I think the rate review committee and the city council, in adopting the rate review committee recommendations, has done a great job of getting reserves within the standard industry guidelines, and being a part of the discussion every time we do this update. I'll come back to reserves in a minute, but I just wanted to touch on the other component of the revenue requirements, which is the debt service. And you do have significant debt service that was primarily related to the wastewater treatment plant loan. There's a balance. I think, Brenda, one of your other questions was wanting to know what about the debt issues and how much remain. This shows you how much for each of these two loans is still yet to be paid off. You can see that in 2028, that last payment for the effluent reuse loan, which was it's a component of the wastewater treatment plant, that will be paid off. So it'll be very nice to have additional capacity here to cash fund capital if needed. Additional debt can be issued, but you know, generally, if we can continue to cash fund, that saves everybody money in the long term because there's no interest costs. So this graph then puts it all together. So you've got your operation and maintenance costs, which I have broken down into these various components. The personnel, other O&M, which is materials and services, and the interfund kind of reimbursements and things. So those are the first two bars are your operation maintenance requirements. And then this teal, I guess, is capital transfers. So it's basically cash funding capital, but it's moving it over to that capital fund to be used as needed for the CIP projects. And then you've got debt service, which is the blue, the darker blue, which you can see in the last year, the plan is lower than in the prior years. So the reserves, and this is just these are the reserves in the operating fund or the sewer fund. That's this lighter blue line. The darker blue line up top is the revenue from rates that are projected. So again, we start at 9 million, and that increases. The slope of that line reflects both the 3.5% annual rate increases as well as any customer growth, that's projected. And you can see that, as I said, you've got some years where the expenses are greater than the revenue, and in other years, the revenue is greater than the projected expenses. When that occurs, we increase the fund balance, as shown in the light blue line going up. in the first few years, and then in the latter half of the plan, where the bars are higher than the revenue line, then the fund balance decreases somewhat, but it's not significantly out of alignment. It's the costs, the revenue is pretty much covering the costs during this planning period, and the ending fund balance stays fairly stable and within or above, slightly above what we have identified here as the minimum balance. And this is consistent with the prior plan, which would be to have the 60-day O&M contingency and a year of debt service. And here is where that consideration of depreciation comes in, because what we've said here is that for rate stabilization purposes, we would include about 5% of annual rate revenue included in that minimum balance. That's a pretty typical number. And then also depreciation, so which is about 2% overall of the asset value. So this is intended to be all-encompassing kind of reserves of, I want something for cash flow, I want to be able to stabilize my rates, I want to be able to meet my debt service. So so you're right within line, even within this in this plan and the 3.5% rate increases for that type of reserve.
Hey, Deb, before we leave that
Yeah.
graph.
Yeah.
And this kind of harks back to Ron's question earlier. The differences in the heights in each year is due to major changes in capital transfers.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
why is it so high? And then it's really low and then increases to a moderate amount. Like, for example, it's about $9 million there. And yet, like, if you look at this table that was generated, the total on the bottom, total CIP is only 5.7 million. I mean, there's a big difference there.
Well, again, so this first year is related to just a change in the city practice of, and I can't speak to this. This is just it's just moving. You're right. This bar in 2021-22, this capital transfer is not the same as what the cash capital needs are for that particular year.
Right.
But it's transferring more than is needed.
Mm-hmm.
And but that amount is used over the course of, and that's why you can see here that those transfers drop off significantly, because you've still got a bunch of cash sitting over there. So at the end, that graph I showed earlier, where you start out with about $6 million, or at the end of fiscal 21-22, you have about 4 million that you haven't spent of this transfer.
Right.
That gets spent over the course of the plan, and that's why we can have these lower transfers initially, and then we kind of get into more of I'm transferring over kind of a level amount that's more in line with what is needed. So it's just it's all wastewater money. It's just kind of being moved to different funds, but it is I was just showing here what was in the budget, not necessarily what was needed that year.
Okay.
So my last chart, I think, is just a reminder of what we talked about in the first meeting, of when we think about the financial resiliency of these systems. And these are necessary systems. They, for public health, they are, regulated by various agencies that, because of the environmental issues and whatnot, that we need to be able to fund them. And in terms of planning for resiliency within these utilities, part of it's reserves, as we've talked about, because that allows you to meet the needs without, part of the thing is not to have double-digit rate increases, so that people can plan more and have smaller incremental increases. The rate structure, so that it can withstand major shock to the system, like, oh, there's a pandemic and people are using water differently. Well, at least 30 to 40% of my costs are coming in on a fixed basis and won't be disrupted as much by changes in usage patterns. And the continued rate increases we talked about, we saw on the national level what happens when you defer increases, and Newberg has experienced this years before the current last 10 years. If you don't have those rate increases, you defer them, it just means you're going to pay more later. So just a reminder about that. Next steps is the wastewater in another wastewater meeting, rates by customer class and rate component. We'll talk about shifts. There may be, when we talk about a 3.5% rate increase, that doesn't mean that each part of the rates or each customer class will go up at the same rate. And we'll talk about that next time. And we'll look at what does a 3.5% overall increase mean in terms of the customer bills. And we'll review those findings with you, I believe, on the 17th, if I got my date right. Oops. Yeah. So thanks for your attention, and sorry for it was kind of long, but hopefully informative.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Deb?
So one of the comments that comes up, and I think it's helpful to start dialoguing this now, is the comparison to other municipalities around us. When we get customer feedback, or customer, gosh, thinking work, sorry. When we get citizen feedback throughout the process, they'll come in with their water bill, and they'll come in with water bill and they'll say, gosh, I moved from X place to Newberg and it's so much more higher. Wow. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's my preface to setting up Deb with the question of, I know there's an analysis at the end of how we get that comparison, and that's provided. Is there something you can give to the others now that kind of helps them in context of how Newberg versus other areas? You've already highlighted throughout your presentation that there's a lot of systematic similarities on your approach to how other places do it. When it comes to the cost piece, I know that there's a history here. There's a history of the 2008, the CRC. After 2008, there was a reluctance to do any rate increases, which caused some much larger significant raises subsequently to help capture that, because we didn't have enough cash reserves to take care of our facility systems. Is there more that you can kind of share, just kind of make sure that everyone hears the approach, just on our comparison from our city to other cities?
Yeah, and this is a really good point, Ron. And I should have included in my next steps is that we'll also be bringing bill comparisons. And I don't know, and if somebody at the city can answer this question, jump in. But as you remember, and probably Ned too, last time the city contracted with a consultant that had developed kind of a rate database that could then bring in bills for different types of customers from cities with similar population and things. And I don't know if the plan is to utilize that same source of information. In prior updates, their information was pulled by city staff. So however, the method is we will bring comparative information, and you're absolutely correct that while the city's rate setting practices are similar, its system is in some cases, there are a lot of differences across systems in physical infrastructure, in institutional arrangements, whether it's a regional system versus a single system, like in the case of the city. We have a lot of regional wastewater utilities in Oregon, and our comparisons are going to focus on Oregon utilities. So, for water supply, there's some very, different water supply costs, even within the, Portland area, and certainly across the state. So it's really good to start understanding that while there are similar rate setting practices, systems are different. And Karin, Katie, either of you want to talk more about any of that? Please jump in.
I'll jump in a little bit and just reiterate that as Deb noted, and Ron and Ned probably remember, again, we have differences between whether things are regional or single entity systems. Obviously, regional systems, you can spread the costs out amongst a larger base. There's also the fact that we have quite a bit of an older system. So we are still trying to fix some of our problems, do replacement of pipe. Pipe is good, depending on the type of pipe, anywhere from 50 to 100 years old. And we have a lot of pipe in the ground that is in that age range. So that makes a difference also versus a newer city, say Tualatin, which is a relatively new city in the sense that we really started getting built in the 70s, right? So it's only, 30, 40 years old, whereas we are significantly older than that. So it makes a lot of difference. And then, as Deb noted on a couple slides earlier, we have a significant debt that we're paying off. So that is, all of those pieces factor into that. But yeah, we will bring back some comparisons between us and finding other cities as close to us as possible. So we're comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges.
I'll just say, I think it's really important for each one of us, as our citizens come into the meeting and talk to us, but even if someone grabs us and asks us, hey, my water bill, my bill looks like this, why? It's important to know, right? It's important to be able to break it down and explain it, because that's been, especially the water part is the biggest one. The water bill that Newberg has versus like Tualatin was one example. Someone said, I can't believe that. And one thing I was thinking about after from last time, there is a tax piece, and we talked to it later, but it's helpful to kind of set this up. And maybe you did this last meeting. Stop me if I am repeating any kind of that. And maybe it's more deal with water and other parts of the facilities. But because we have the university, because we have a lot of churches, we have a lot of nonprofits, how we get the revenues to cover what we do is a factor. I think there's also a total cost piece, because I've been digesting this. Why is our, when we went through the assessment of facilities and all the rates, and the way people coming in going, this is insane, this is much, look at my bill compared to Tualatin to Newberg. I'm thinking about going back and going, okay, what's your property tax, right? Is there property, because property tax I think is a little bit lower here than that. And is that factored into this? I don't know. I think that as we go forward, we should be able to at least, we'll do this in the conclusion, but as we build it, that's the question I've got to answer. Is that person says, my water bill when I lived in Tualatin is smaller than when I lived in Newberg. Why? And you can pick your favorite utility. We need to be able to talk to that. So I'm priming Deb for the end. That's the question I've got to have answered, right? And we got to do, and hopefully we can do a better job than last time. because they walked away and they said, they literally didn't believe us. Because they're going, here's my bills. We don't agree.
Great, thanks.
Ron, I can give you all of my bills from my house in Sherwood.
No, thank you.
It was way higher in Sherwood, I can tell you.
And one thing, again, I apologize for not missing the first one. There is a fundamental thing as far as the approach to all this that I don't know that umbrellas all this, and that is we want to have the money necessary for the city to do the necessary repairs of their systems. Right? If something comes up, we want them to be able to address it. We got ourselves in a situation back in 2008 into 2010, 2011. We didn't have that cash reserve. That's important as Deb talks through this cash reserve to be able to do what we need to do. So yeah, we've got some plans and some things we need to take place and stuff. And sometimes it gets done. Sometimes those projects don't get done based upon what happens throughout the year. They've got the funds to do that. And we weren't in that situation. So our rates did increase to a point so that was a little bit aggressive to help give us that revenue buffer that we didn't have in the past. And so that's an important piece to maintain so that we have robust systems, as Deb was saying, so that when we ask for water, you get water. If you want, your sewer systems work.
Deb, can you take down the rest of the PowerPoint screen so we can see each other?
Oh yeah, good
You're
point.
done?
I am done. Let's see. How do I end stop share right there? Okay.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else have any questions for either Deb or Karen? Guess not. Okay.
Always thank you. Thank you for your efforts. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for your efforts. I appreciate it. That was actually very, very informative and I appreciate it a lot. So next time we're gonna have further information, and the way we get that is, Sarah, from looking at the City of Newberg app, or what do you call it? I can't think of the name, sorry. I have OLD disease.
The website, yes. So typically the
website.
agenda or the packet gets established the Friday prior to the meeting, and then I will send, either I or Katie will send out an email letting you know that the agenda is ready, and then we'll do like the hyperlink so you can check out the agenda there.
Okay,
If it's
perfect.
easier, we can attach it. If that's something you guys would prefer, I can do that too.
Brenda, do you have an email account set up here?
You know, I do, but I have a really hard time getting into it for some reason or another.
Okay, well,
Again, it's probably OLD disease. I mean,
okay.
but you know, I can get into the website. So if I can get it there, it's fine.
Okay. Do we have any public comments tonight?
No, we do not.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have anything else? All right. Well, do we have to move to close the meeting?
You just adjourn it.
You just adjourn it? Okay. Well, if nobody has anything else, I guess we'll just adjourn for the night. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a good meeting. Okay. Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good night.